In this video, we're going to look at the range of the square root function. And there's a few things to know before you start this lesson. Make sure you know what the range of a function is, and we'll actually review that in a second. You know the basics of the square root graph, and you know how to do graph transformations when you take that square root graph and move it around. All right, so real quick before we get on to how to do this, just a quick recap of what the range is. The range is all the outputs of your function, and that's just the y values of my function. Normally for a domain, you can just use the expression to find the domain, but for range, for me, it's always easier to look at the graph. So we're gonna always graph these functions first, and then from there, figure out the range. So remember, we're just looking at the y values on the graph. Before we begin talking about range of the square root functions using graphs, there's one more transformation we have to learn, and that's when you start including negative signs. All right, so if I just take my original function and put a negative sign in front of it, I go from this graph here to this graph here, and you see that all that happens is it just flips upside down. When I take this whole function and just put a negative sign in front of it, all that happens is it goes from up to down. All right, so a negative sign at the front just flips your graph and makes it go the opposite direction. So like a parabola normally has these two kind of arrows going up. When I put a negative in front of it, I just have these two arrows going down. And the same thing's true for square root functions, which is the one we're actually focused on. For a square root, if I just put a negative in front of it, instead of having my normal kind of upward curve, now it's going to be a little downward curve. And it doesn't matter if I do transformations first. If I take this whole function, just put a negative in front of it, it just flips it to go the opposite direction. All right, so that's the important thing to note. It's the negative sign in front of your square root or in front of your squared just flips the direction of your graph. All right, so in summary, if you multiply a function by a negative, the graph of the function will flip in the opposite direction. So it'll either go from an upward parabola to a downward parabola. If you're talking about squaring something, square root, it'll go from this kind of half upward curve to that downward curve. All right, so now we can figure out the range of these square root functions. And we're always going to start off with graphing it. So this is exactly a graph you would have done when learning about transformations. So the square root of x minus 2 plus 3. The plus 3 moves the starting point up to there. The minus 2 moves it right to there. All right, so that is the kind of starting point for my graph. There's no negatives in this one, so it's my normal square root graph like that. All right, so that's the graph of this function. And now I want to find the range. And remember, the range is the y values. And to figure out the range, I kind of start at the bottom of my graph, which is here. And I go to the top of my graph. But because of this little arrow, there's no top of my graph. It just keeps going this way forever. So really, there's just the bottom. So my range, it's all the y values, and all the y values are bigger than or equal to 3. All right, they start here at 3. And because this is a closed dot, because I actually hit 3, I have the equal sign. And then it just keeps going forever. So there's no ending point. It's just everything that's bigger than 3. All right, you could also write this if you wanted to. All right, but generally, we kind of start these with the variable. All right, so that's the range. So you just graph it, figure out the lowest y value, and it just goes off forever after that. All right, here's one with a square root function. All right, just because it's similar. All right, but if I wanted to graph this one, I notice a couple things. First, it's a square root function, so it's going to be a parabola. There's a plus 1 on the inside, which is going to be my graph left 1. There's a minus 1 on the outside, which is going to be my graph down 1. So this is my starting point. And there's a negative here, which instead of drawing my parabola like this, the negative means my parabola goes downward. So that is my graph in red. And now I want to find the range. The range is the y values. If I try to start at the bottom, because of these arrows, there's no bottom. It just keeps going down forever. But there is a top here. My graph ends. The top of my graph is right there. So my range, it's everything below -1. So if it's below -1, it would be less than or equal to -1. All right, so my range is all the y values that are less than or equal to -1. All right, by just graphing it and seeing what y values am I hitting. My highest value is -1, and I hit everything below it. All right, here's one with a square root again. Again, there's kind of 3 important things to recognize: there's this negative, this plus 2, and this minus 3. So the -3 moves my starting point down. The plus 2 moves my starting point left. and the negative means I'm going to have a downward square root curve. And what is the range going to be? This is similar to the one we just did because there's no bottom. All right, this just keeps going down forever, but there is a top right there. So the range is all the y values. All right, there is -3, so everything that's less than or equal to -3. So just by quickly graphing these functions, I can see what y values is my graph going to hit. All right, here's one for you to try on your own. All right, determine the range of this square root function. All right, I'll throw you the answer in 3, 2, 1. All right, and the range you should get is y is less than or equal to 1. Just a quick explanation. This +1 moves it up 1. There's nothing inside the square root, so there's no left or right. And then it's just a downward square root because of that. And you can see all the y values I'm hitting. I'm starting at +1 and just going down. All right, so now it's time to practice. You don't have to graph these if you can kind of visualize what's happening enough. You don't have to graph them, but for me, graphing a function is a little bit easier to figure out the range than trying to do it just with the expression. But do what works for you and try to practice finding the range of these functions.